When Barron Trump gave up his first-class seat to an elderly veteran, no one expected the surprising family moment that would happen during the flight. What occurred next left everyone on the plane speechless. The cabin lights flickered slightly as passengers settled into their seats. There was the usual mix of pre-flight excitement and mild chaos in the air. It was a chilly morning at Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport, and Flight 247 to Newark was fully booked. Among the travelers was a young man sitting in first class. A face many recognized right away, though his quiet attitude suggested he wished they wouldn't. It was Barron Trump, now a teenager, standing over 6 feet tall. He sat quietly by the window, reading a hardcover book. Unlike others in his family, Barron rarely appeared in public, but the name on his boarding pass made it impossible to avoid attention. Across the aisle, an elderly man in his late 70s walked toward the economy section. His silver hair was neatly combed, his back was slightly hunched, and his walk was slow but steady as he held his boarding pass in an old leather duffel bag. Passengers glanced at each other as he passed by. His military jacket, covered with faded patches and medals, told a story of service and sacrifice. Some passengers whispered to each other. Some passengers wondered about the elderly veteran's past, while others simply admired the quiet dignity in his walk. He took his seat near the back of the plane, squeezed between a chatty businessman and a restless toddler. Meanwhile, the flight attendants moved quickly through the aisles, making sure everyone was seated for takeoff. Just as the cabin door closed, there was a sudden tension in the air. The elderly veteran, upset, was asking for a different seat. As he apologized for the inconvenience, the commotion caught Barron's attention from his spot in first class. He watched the scene unfold and leaned slightly into the aisle, his brows furrowed in thought. Then, without saying a word, he pressed the call button for a flight attendant. "Excuse me," Barron said softly when she arrived. "Can I switch seats with the gentleman in the military jacket?" The flight attendant blinked, momentarily shocked. Passengers in first class looked up from their newspapers and tablets, curious about what was happening. Barron's offer was unexpected, especially in a world where privilege often goes unchallenged. But his expression was sincere, and his tone made it clear he wasn't taking no for an answer. Both degenerated, two blurry figures on the wall above them as they vanished. "Let me check," the attendant replied, her voice filled with surprise as she walked quickly toward the back of the plane. As Barron stood up to grab his carry-on bag, the whispers in first class grew louder. A woman across the aisle leaned toward him. "You don't have to do that, you know. You paid for this seat," she said, her voice filled with confusion. Barron simply smiled and shrugged. Some people deserve it more. What happened next changed the mood of the entire flight. The flight attendant returned a few moments later, her face showing both curiosity and admiration. "He said he'd be happy to switch," she told Barron, her voice shaking slightly. It wasn't every day someone gave up a first-class seat, especially a teenager with a name that made people look twice. He was clean enough looking to win the hearts and minds of her underlings in his class. Barron smiled politely and nodded, grabbing his bag before walking down the narrow aisle. Passengers whispered as he passed. Some nudged each other to make sure they were seeing it right, and a few even pulled out their phones, snapping photos discreetly. Barron seemed unaffected by the attention, his focus entirely on the elderly man now seated in the back. When Barron arrived, the elderly veteran looked up, confused. "Are you sure, young man?" he asked, his voice rough but strong. "You don't have to do this for me." "I want to," Barron replied, offering his hand. "Thank you for your service. Please, take my seat." The veteran paused for a moment as if thinking about whether to accept the offer, but the sincerity in Barron's eyes was clear. Slowly, the man stood, shaking Barron's hand firmly. "Well, thank you. That's mighty kind of you." As the veteran made his way to first class, the murmurs among the passengers grew louder. The whispers grew louder. A young mother in row 15 leaned toward her teenage daughter. "Did you see that? He just gave up his seat." The businessman sitting next to Barron looked over, raising an eyebrow. "Never seen anything like that on a flight," he muttered, mostly to himself. Barron slid into the now empty economy seat, adjusting his tall frame to fit the smaller space. He seemed completely comfortable, ignoring the curious stares from fellow passengers. A flight attendant walked by and quietly asked if he needed anything, but Barron simply shook his head and opened his book again. In first class, the veteran settled into the plush seat, clearly overwhelmed by the comfort and kindness. He adjusted the armrest, his hands trembling slightly. A flight attendant came up to him, offering a complimentary drink and a warm blanket. "The young man said you should have this seat," she explained. The veteran smiled faintly. "It's been years since I've been treated like this," he murmured. He glanced back at the economy section, where Barron was calmly reading his book. The gesture had been small, but its impact was huge. Footnote: for a moment, the entire cabin seemed to relax, the tension from boarding fading away. Passengers settled in and the plane taxied onto the runway. But as the engines roared to life and the plane lifted into the air, the story was far from over. What seemed like a simple act of kindness was about to take a turn that no one could have predicted. Then, the veteran spoke. As the flight reached cruising altitude and the soft hum of the engines filled the cabin, flight attendants moved through the aisles with drinks and snacks. But the atmosphere was anything but routine. Passengers couldn't stop glancing between Barron Trump in economy and the elderly veteran in first class. Whispers of admiration spread, but the story was just beginning to unfold. The veteran sat quietly at first, sipping his water and staring out the window, his hands resting on his lap with a slight tremor. Then, as if moved by the weight of the moment, he turned to the passenger seated next to him, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes. "I have to say something," he began, his voice just loud enough to be heard. The woman looked at him, curious. The veteran adjusted the small pin on his lapel, a purple heart, and sighed deeply. "The young man who gave me this seat, his family saved my life once." The woman blinked, surprised. "What do you mean?" she asked. The veteran leaned back in his seat, his voice growing steadier as he began his story. "It was decades ago, during the Vietnam War. I was stationed overseas, far from home, with no family support. I'd been badly injured, shot twice in the leg. When I finally got back to the States, I was lost. No direction, no purpose, nothing," he said, his voice wavering slightly, but he continued. "It took me 37 years to find a spot in the mine, back in Texas, where I was originally from." He thought about that. "I ended up in New York, trying to rebuild my life. I didn't have a place to stay and barely enough money for food. One day I ran into a man outside a diner who saw me struggling. He didn't just hand me $1 and walk away. He sat with me, listened to my story. That man was Donald Trump's father, Fred." The woman's eyes widened. A few passengers nearby, who had been quietly listening, leaned in closer. "Fred Trump?" she asked. The veteran nodded, his expression growing more thoughtful. "Yes, he didn't owe me anything, but he made sure I had a roof over my head and a job to get back on my feet. He never asked for anything in return. He just told me, 'You served this country. It's the least we can do.' I'll never forget those words." By now, the conversation had caught the attention of several passengers in first class, and the story began to spread through the cabin. The veteran's voice grew stronger as he continued, his eyes misting with gratitude. "I always wanted to thank his family, but I never got the chance. Life moved on, and I thought the moment was lost forever. And now, today, that man's grandson, he's given me a gift I'll never forget. What are the odds of something like this happening in economy?" In the economy section, Barron sat, unaware of the growing excitement around the plane. He was focused on his book, his long legs awkwardly tucked into the small space. But in first class, the veteran's story had sparked something deeper. Passengers began exchanging looks, whispers of amazement spreading quickly through the cabin. One of the flight attendants leaned toward the veteran. "Would you like me to tell him what you just shared?" she asked softly. The veteran hesitated, then shook his head. "No, not yet. Let the boy have his piece. He doesn't need to know how much this means to me. Not right now." But the passengers couldn't hold back their surprise. What started as a simple act of kindness now felt like something much bigger, as if fate had brought this moment together. And then, something even more remarkable happened. The veteran sat quietly for a few moments, his story hanging in the air like an unspoken challenge. Nearby, passengers exchanged glances, some leaning in closer to share their own thoughts in hushed tones. The flight had changed from a routine journey into something much more meaningful. It was the man sitting directly across from the veteran who broke the silence. He was in his early 40s, with a tired but friendly face. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "But your story really hit home. My grandfather served in Vietnam too. He used to talk about how much it meant when people back home cared enough to help. Hearing about what Fred Trump did for you, well, that's rare. Too rare." The veteran nodded, a faint smile forming on his lips. "It's the little things, son. People don't realize how far a small act of kindness can go. Back then, I thought my life was over, but that man's generosity gave me a second chance." Across the aisle, a young mother, holding a sleeping toddler in her arms, joined in. "You know, my dad used to say the same thing. He wasn't a veteran, but he always told me that when someone lifts you up, even just a little, you pass it on. It's like a chain reaction. What Barron did today, it's proof that kindness still matters." The veteran's eyes softened as he listened. "It's true, and it's not just about big gestures. Sometimes just being seen, being acknowledged, can change everything. That's what Fred Trump did for me, and it's what his grandson has done for me again today." The passengers continued to share their stories, each one more heartfelt than the last. A flight attendant, visibly moved, sat on the armrest of an empty seat near the veteran. "I wasn't planning to say anything," she admitted, "but my brother served in Iraq. He didn't talk much about it, but when he came home, he told me that the people who stopped to thank him or helped him in small ways, those were the moments that stuck with him. Sometimes, those moments were the only thing keeping him going." The veteran nodded in understanding, his expression a mix of empathy and quiet pride. "Your brother's right, it's the little things that keep you grounded when everything else feels like it's falling apart." In economy, Barron noticed a few passengers glancing back at him. Their faces showed a mix of awe and gratitude. He didn't fully understand what was happening yet, but he gave a polite nod to one woman who smiled at him. His gesture, though small, had started a chain of reflections and connections that no one on that flight could have predicted. The veteran turned to the flight attendant and said, "You know, I've always believed that gratitude doesn't just stop with the person who helps you. It grows. Fred Trump helped me rebuild my life, and I've spent every day since trying to honor that by helping others. Today, Barron reminded me of that mission. It's funny how life works, isn't it?" The plane hit a patch of turbulence, jolting everyone slightly, but the mood in the cabin stayed calm. The conversations felt like a shared release, as if everyone on board was connected by an invisible thread of kindness, gratitude, and human resilience. And just as the plane began its descent into Newark, the most unexpected moment of all unfolded. At the desk, the conversations in first class quieted. The veteran sat with his hands folded, staring out of the window, deep in thought. Across the cabin, passengers exchanged knowing glances, some still amazed by the unusual turn of events. Just as the captain announced the final approach, the flight attendant who had been listening earlier approached Barron in economy. She knelt slightly to meet his eye level and spoke softly. "I wanted to let you know that the gentleman you gave your seat to, he shared something extraordinary about your family. Would you like to hear it?" Barron looked up from his book, curiosity piqued. He slowly closed the cover, the title unreadable to those around him. "Sure," he replied simply, his tone calm but intrigued. The attendant hesitated for a moment, as if searching for the right words. "Years ago, your grandfather, Fred Trump, helped him when he was at his lowest point. He said your grandfather gave him a place to live and a job, expecting nothing in return. And today you did something for him that reminded him of that kindness." For a moment, Barron didn't speak. His expression stayed calm, but his eyes softened as the weight of the revelation settled over him. Finally, he said, "That's something, isn't it?" The flight attendant smiled. "It is. I thought you should know." As the plane touched down, the veteran stood, preparing to disembark. To everyone's surprise, he walked directly to the economy section, his eyes scanning the rows until they landed on Barron's. The young man, now standing to retrieve his bag, looked up in surprise. A sound like dripping water startled them. The veteran extended his hand. "Young man, I wanted to thank you face to face. What you did today, it brought me full circle. Your family has a history of kindness, and you've carried that forward. Never forget how much these moments matter." Barron shook his hand firmly, his voice steady but quiet. "I didn't do anything special, sir. You deserved it." The cabin was silent now, with passengers watching the exchange unfold in complete attention. Some had tears in their eyes, while others wore small, thoughtful smiles. The connection between these two men, generations apart, felt like a living example of the power of empathy and gratitude. As the passengers disembarked, many paused to thank Barron for his gesture. Others approached the veteran, offering handshakes and words of gratitude for his service. The mood was unlike anything anyone had experienced on a flight before. At the gate, the veteran turned once more before leaving, tipping his hat toward Barron. "You've got a good heart, son. Don't ever lose that." Barron nodded, his usual reserved demeanor softening just enough to show the impact of the words. As he walked toward baggage claim, he pulled out his phone and typed a brief message. He hesitated for a moment, then hit send. The text read, "Grandpa would have been proud of today." This story is a reminder of how one small act of kindness can ripple far beyond its moment, connecting people in ways we never expect. Kindness, gratitude, and empathy. These values transcend time and place, creating bonds that last. If this story inspired you, don't forget to share it. Let's keep the conversation going and remind the world that kindness still matters. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and join us next time for another unforgettable journey.